Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us again on another one of our Althea live calls. Sorry we had to reschedule that last week for internet issues, which of course is very timely and topical as we talk about Althea and some of the systemic issues involved in utilities, telecom, and infrastructure. For those who may not know me, I'm Deborah Sampier, CEO of Hawk Networks and co-founder of Althea, which is the payment layer for machine-to-machine settlement, which means that we can build the financial stack for revolutionizing systems like telecom, utilities like energy, and anything in which we're utilizing machines. So excited to be here today with Aaron, who's going to introduce himself and share what they're working on at Maya. And hopefully I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah. Perfect. Sounds good.
I think there's a lot of intersection with the work that y'all are doing and thinking about intentional, kind of infrastructure building, the system design, which is a lot of very much what's intrinsic at Althea as well. If you're joining and are on a computer or a phone, you can ask us questions on Twitter or Discord or YouTube or wherever you're joining us from, LinkedIn, and be happy to answer those as we go along too. It's open conversation. So, with that said, I will turn that over to Aaron to introduce yourself. Tell us what you're working on.
Cool. So I'm Aaron. Lovely to meet everyone. But I'm the founder of Maya. In essence, Maya is a nation-state operating system built on a global governance layer. A lot of the work that we do today is actually a digitization of pretty much most of my career over the last 10 years, which has been in infrastructure, especially sort of on the economic advisory side of things, giving nation states across emerging markets from Africa, Middle East, and Southeast Asia essentially sovereignty of infrastructure, supporting them to essentially from the ground up and educating them. In 2017, I think 2018, I wrote a paper known as the Sovereign Development Partnership, which addressed a lot of the, let's say, the mishappenings that were happening, as well as where a lot of the frameworks provided by the UN, the IMF, the World Bank were letting these countries down. A lot of these countries rely on foreign direct investment, but a lot of it is, well, 90 to 95% of that capital actually goes to a third party company that sits outside the country. So there's very little retention of US dollar liquidity. And as a result, that is the fundamental risk of developing infrastructure in these markets. So a lot of it, in short, was to sort of push sovereignty in these nations. Been in crypto, I guess, since 2013, 2014, with one of my first businesses, which was in the print media space, but have pretty much worked across most of, let's say, war-torn nations from Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Somalia, being on the ground and actually seeing a lot of the challenges that existed. And that kind of led me to realizing that to address these challenges, we really need to be more, let's say, systemic in how we approached it. And there's a really nice convergence as well, because a lot of these protocols that we've kind of been developing in the crypto space, etc., have the ability, and I think this really isn't understood from the industry as a whole, to actually give sovereignty back to nations. And that's really the go-to-market for them. But we're still kind of in this sphere of like crypto Twitter and marketing to ourselves. But once you kind of break out of that, there is a means to giving sovereignty, like things like Hive Mapper or something can actually give a country the ability to host maps within their country themselves without that leakage to sort of US hyperscalers. And what you're doing as well is sort of empowering the telecom sector, where you've got all of this capital that's sort of, let's say, relying on entities that are from Europe, the US, etc. There's a lot of data leakage as well that sort of comes out of that. And so a lot about what Maya does is actually kind of focused on turning data into an asset and allowing governments to make more proactive decisions. So with this governance layer that we've created, we're elevating citizens, organizations up into global governance in parity with nation states, creating essentially a coordination system that allows for any application that's built on top of it, whether it be foreign direct investment, governance super app, which is one of our sort of our modules, etc., to happen a lot more streamlined. But also allowing users or citizens, organizations to value data as an asset and share that data to a government through encrypted means like ZK, FHE, etc., so that they can make more proactive decisions, whether that be on economic policy, on the health side of things, on the infrastructure, etc. It's really about changing the way that governance works, moving from these top-down hierarchical systems that are 20th century, more appropriate to the industrial age or the analog environment, and turning governance essentially into an ecosystem.
Yeah, I wanted to tease out a couple of things there if I can. I mean, this idea of sovereignty is obviously very big with how we think about things too. The idea that there's agency and choice. And I think a lot of that is economic agency as well too. You bring sovereignty back. We're certainly hearing a lot of this in the enterprise space in general, whether it's either countries like you said, nation states, or if it's companies, right, or even individuals looking at how they bring back that sovereignty. Um, and I'm wondering, how are you seeing that manifesting itself? I mean, we're seeing it a lot of times where even a company said, look, I want to run my communication for that data leak, which I want that sovereignty. I also want the economic sovereignty. I'm paying a lot of money for infrastructure run by someone else. I could own that infrastructure and keep that value back either in my community or within my own business. But I'm curious how that then, this sovereignty, how you're seeing that translate in a practical way.
Yeah, like I think I've worked with governments for a decade, and it's not a quick process by any means. But I think that there's a really nice, well, the pendulum swinging. Let's say that the pendulum swinging from globalization towards nationalism or mercantilism, where countries are essentially looking to restrict the amounts of imports and developing a level of sovereignty. And I think COVID-19 really woke nations up to a lot of the supply chain bottlenecks. Obviously, the US has made a huge shift in terms of onshoring production, etc. But for example, I'm here in the UAE, and this was a big thing here that over the last sort of 5, 6 years, and quite a lot of my work has revolved around it, which is kind of reducing this reliance on imported products. And we're a massively import heavy nation. And it started with, I guess, COVID realizing, okay, there's a lot of hardware that we're relying on importing. And it wasn't really touching on the software level. And I think that's still like we're going through a massive education curve with governments because they're localizing sort of manufacture and the hardware production, but it's very much addressing, let's say, the physical layer of the economy. And right now, the economy is split between the physical and the virtual layer. And as everything that we're working and we're developing, more and more of that economy is now going to shift onto the virtual layer. And governments today don't have a means to capitalize on it. And even more so, I think one thing I think governments have started to wake up to, and I think the United Nations as well is doing quite well on this because they've actually raised the idea of bringing intangible assets onto the balance sheet, changing the way accounting happens, and valuing data as an asset. So we're seeing a lot of, I would say, model changes, new regulation in governments that change the viewpoint on how data is looked at. A clear example, obviously, China's one example of how they handle data. We're very much similar here in the UAE, but it's for national security interests, etc. If you look at Uganda, Uganda's just released essentially an open data policy. So there's this kind of waking up. I think US hyperscalers kind of alerted the world to the value of data and how they're able to monetize it. And now it's sort of trickling down into the nation states, or trickling up, you could say, to the nation state level and to sort of other SMEs. And I'm sure you've probably seen it as well. I know we've spoken about other companies as well that you're working with that are sort of looking to capture some of that data themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, right? As we start to figure out monetization, there's also the liquidity, right? So the liquidity of a data marketplace, then even increases the value. So I think that's what's exciting about not only what can happen with the data marketplace, but what's going to happen with that on a blockchain side. But I want to just kind of come back to something you said about how the world is sort of changing, shifting around from globalization to more sovereignty. But one of the great things about blockchain is that money can move between parties internationally. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about it when you're thinking about, especially as you're thinking about infrastructure, large scale projects. I mean, this is we've got liquid infrastructure. That's the tokenization of the telecom assets themselves. And there's a lot of really interesting financial tooling that comes around that. But we think about that really globally. So I'm curious about that interplay there with infrastructure, large scale capital projects, globalization. How does that all fit together with this time
Yeah,
and
I
place?
think it opens up a massive opportunity, especially on like the liquid infrastructure side of things, because like dial back to obviously what I was saying with a lot of these nation states that lack US dollar liquidity, lack the capabilities. There's now a means for essentially the tokenization of the assets, the collateralization of those tokens in order to finance further growth, finance trade, where we see it like dabbled in everything from sort of fuel trade to commodities trade, etc. And they're in a position where, because they don't even have a credit rating, they're not able to issue bankable financial instruments that could be collateralized to sort of raise finance to actually bring in the imports they need. There was a really good case, for example, in 2019 with Malawi, who had an IMF loan. So they took an IMF loan in 2019, COVID hits, and suddenly all of that capital has to be spent on consumables like fertilizer and fuel. So there's
Oh,
not
wow.
a means to actually generating productivity of it. Whereas if they had Althea on the table and liquid infrastructure, there's a means to tokenizing those assets, those cash flowing assets, in order to fund further growth, fund a lot of those consumables. And if we look at really the sort of the intangible asset market versus the tangible, it's magnitudes larger in the intangible space. And I'm talking like obviously not just on the data side of things, I'm talking on the infra, I'm talking on human capital as well, which is huge. We're looking at 50 trillion plus of essentially
Hmm.
intangible assets that each nation state has, but is unable to capitalize on. So I think once we start looking into, I think they're starting to understand it. Let's put it that way. There's an understanding now.
Right.
Like I don't think it's too difficult to understand if you can dial it back to terms that kind of the inception of capital, yeah, from a barter arrangement, counter trade, for example. We
Right.
saw a lot of this kind of localization of national currency and using local currencies for trade. But one of the things that I've worked on in the past was actually financing of infrastructure against a commodity. So we built out about a 250 megawatt solar plant in a country which I can't mention, but they paid in a very precious commodity. And we essentially developed a financial structure. But if this was tokenized, so just to give you an idea of how this sort of worked, so and the means of tokenization to simplify it is that we're building out a solar plant. And that solar plant requires essentially payment terms. And generally, those payment terms are an advance payment and then milestone delivery,
Sure.
traditional to all sorts of infrastructure. So they were putting that advance payment as this commodity. This commodity would need to be picked up by a very large conglomerate who would then sell it, pay us, and we're essentially reliant through this structure. And it's not necessary once you start to bring tokenization into the mix. And there's a lot more security. And I think it opens up a massive door to sovereignty, obviously allowing, it's a borderless environment, put it that way. We're building borderless economies when we start to look at tokenization of assets.
Yeah, we 100% agree. But one thing that I think is really interesting about the work that y'all are doing is on the governance layer, right? So very early on in Althea's, and Althea's been around for a long time as well, right? Working on these since about 2017. I've been in the market about the same as long as you have, about 2012, 2013, somewhere in that range. Um, but governance in crypto has gone through some some back and forth. But that's one of the kind of missing things is like how do people coordinate around these large projects on the financial side as well. So I'm really curious about that. I'm curious about your thoughts about why, like some of the DAO structures, like Instagon, that were some of the early ones. Why did those maybe kind of fail that miss the mark? Was it just timing, and then this is better timing? So yeah, curious about your thoughts not only on like governance now, but how does
It's
this?
funny. I think I actually just tweeted today that any crypto governance project is never going to exist in the real world. um, and that,
Right.
look, I think I derive a lot of that from basically, look, if we were front runners to the industry, we sort of developed a lot of the baseline infrastructure, but that was more of an education curve. Let's say we're now entering the Series A of the industry. We're not getting those 1,000Xs anymore, and at
Right.
this Series A, we're moving into an M&A environment. So we're seeing the Web2 businesses that really already capture the value and have the distribution, either developing their own protocols or acquiring existing ones. So when I look at the way the governance space is, and I think a lot of this happens from the way the industry is kind of focused and centered very internally without having a very clear understanding of the way the real world works. And this is kind of the challenge here. And I think
Right.
look, I think when we start to think about decentralization, centralization arguments, etc., all of it's irrelevant. What matters is consensus and coordination, and that's the way and approach that Maya really takes with this as well. Is that if we kind of let's say zoom out onto the fractal of nation states, you've got Western nations across Europe and the US, who we could say have a very decentralized system. They've got a democracy, there's a lot of voting, but we can see right now there's a lot of bureaucracy in the management of that system, and they're entering into a stage where they need to really accelerate and coordinate a lot better, and they're struggling. Whereas you kind of approach that to a more centralized system, like here in the UAE or, for example, in China, where we've kind of had a massive acceleration because there's a mission, everyone's aligned, and there's coordination that kind of exists to kind of execute on it. And when you've kind of got too many voices, etc., and not a clear direction of where this is going, it's a big struggle. I would say that if we look at the Ethereum ecosystem, they went through that miscoordination. They decentralized too early. As a result, it kind of that they lack the coordination to really execute on a roadmap in a quick succession. Similar to kind of like Bitcoin. Bitcoin's decentralized to the point that if we were to issue a proposal, it takes way too long to execute on it, as opposed to like more of a centralized facility. So I look at sort of protocol designs as well, as similar to the way nation states are. If you're in a major development curve, you need as much centralization as possible to essentially control the coordination. It gets a lot harder to. I fight the thesis myself internally, but it's just from understanding how countries are built and working at that level. And it's very difficult when a country or a protocol is at its very early inception stage where you need to build. You need a lot more centralized control of that system and to be able to manage that coordination. There comes a point of maturity where we've seen in Singapore, where you can now decentralize. And that's what Singapore's, I think, has actually perfected on perfectly, is that they went through this massive sort of centralized control with Lee Kuan Yew, and now they've got to a point of maturity in the economy where, yes, we can decentralize, we can implement a democracy. And that's the kind of approach that I think needs to be taken, unless we develop coordination tools like Maya that we're building, which integrate with these systems and allow for more embedded, let's say, technocracy within the systems.
Yeah, I think there's something kind of interesting that got, you're kind of sussing out there around, the practical coordination that works fairly well, right? Validators come to consensus, and a lot of those kind of more smaller systems. I mean, you see also like federated, municipal, smaller groups that then can have more agency, right? And I think a lot of the way that we kind of see system design with the Althea infrastructure is more smaller, federated types of coordination around infrastructure builds that then can be kind of part of a larger coordinated set. But yeah, because so I think that's kind of it. So there's like kind of two pieces there, right? There's different stakeholders, and that's where you're building. The other piece too is that it's not one set of stakeholders. You have an operator set of stakeholders, you have users, you have maybe capital providers, and they all kind of need to be coordinated as well. And then how those systems actually get implemented and coordinated, I think is the fascinating thing about blockchain. But we do have the benefit, regardless of how centralized or decentralized it is, in creating systems in which there's alignment, right? So that when the users win, the rest of the stakeholders are also winning. And I think that's one of the things in telco that always struck me was that the system really wasn't working for operators either. There's not some sort of like, system in which this is also like profiting one set of people over another. It just wasn't working for anyone. So I think that's really what we're seeing, is breaking down for everyone here.
I think you're completely right there. Like, sort of one of the modules that we've developed is one for foreign direct investment, and obviously telco being a very critical infrastructure space, and reliant on project finance to execute. And if we look at the project finance market, the average time to reach financial close on these projects is 12 months. And a lot of that comes down to the bureaucracy in kind of getting to that stage of project finance, or closing the project finance. And we kind of dialed back and we looked at the way things were done. Obviously, my background in closing a lot of these projects as well. And you've got insurers, reinsurers, lenders, equity allocators, and they've all got a mandate at the end of the day, which is to deploy, to insure, to lend. They're all using exactly the same platforms, exactly to arrive at exactly the same outcome for due diligence. And we looked at it, we're like, well, this doesn't make any sense. But even then, the space and all, not having all the stakeholders around the same table makes things very challenging. My third business called iKilowatt was a project development company. And when we sort of looked at the way projects were being developed, you've got this very hierarchical system. You've got finance at the top, then you've got your project developer, then you've got your contractor, your subcontractor, and all the supply chain. And there's a lot of value add that the supply chain has at the bottom of this pyramid, but it's almost forbidden to have a communication to the finance where lead times could be cut, IRRs could be improved as well. So what we did was we broke down the whole value chain and we brought everyone around consensus circles. And it was the first use of liquid democracy in, I would say, not even a business, but within a hard infrastructure business as well, where we didn't just have all aspects around a singular consensus circle. We also had the government and we also had the local parties as part of that system as well. So they became part of essentially a modular organization structure for that specific project. As a result, you don't have a centralized, let's say, CEO, where that is the central focus. The project becomes the central focus, and you've got all of these sort of counterparties and stakeholders around the table. And that's kind of the approach that we've done on the FDI side of things, is that you have all of these partners who are verified within a singular platform. You as a developer are not going on a roadshow trying to find capital, etc. You have a means for obviously a government to have tokenized assets, and also for these investors, whether it be on the reinsurance side, the insurance, or the debt or the equity side, to also have tokenized pools. So they're in a means and a position to kind of swap between an insurance position in one asset to a debt position in another asset, not going through a counterparty currency or an intermediary currency, sorry. And just by having all of the stakeholders at the table and having that level of coordination where a government's issued a permit, rather than a lawyer going and doing their due diligence, maybe taking weeks to find out if that permit was official, there's essentially like a ZK proof. Yes, the government signs off. Yes, this was issued. And straight away, you've turned what is a weeks-long process into seconds. And that's really like, I think the massive thing is obviously, as you stressed there on blockchain, is that where it's decentralized, centralized, it allows essentially full coordination. Verifiable coordination, I think, is important as well.
Yeah, I think that's a big unlock. I mean, together with kind of like what we're talking about with the liquefying the assets and the revenue streams, and really bringing a lot of those stakeholders to the table, and then being able to unlock it with those sorts of trusted circles. I mean, I think that's really where we get that sort of massive system unlock in infrastructure in the next, which is really, I think, extremely optimistic. I have two questions, and then you can decide how you want which order to answer them. I'm curious about where Maya is in like your development stage. I'm also curious about how you think about AI having its own agency. How do we think about machines sort of plugging in? Obviously, they can be bringing a lot of data, they can be verifying. How do we think about machines interacting in this environment? I think also a curious thing to tease out.
Okay. So Maya, we kind of put the cart before the horse. So yeah, but that's more of an understanding of just how long these sales cycles are. We know conceptually everything works. We know architecturally it all works and everything plugs in. We're about to obviously start our raise and we'll start our build out, but we've already signed MOUs with 2 nation states. We've started to get a lot of interest in with actual corporations that want to onboard as part of the system. And there's various different aspects of, I would say, Maya that are being implemented. So for example, where we're talking to 2 countries in the Middle East, one is looking at essentially an economic policy intelligence system. So through our governance super app, you're able to obviously share all of that data with the government. We overlay that with their sort of economic data today. They can A/B test within a digital environment before they actually execute on it. For example, here locally in the UAE, we're discussing on the health intelligence side of things, where you as a user can share your health records, your genomic data, etc., overlay that with inpatient, outpatient data, pharma procurement schedules, and now you have a means to essentially plot or plan against pandemics, see them happening in real time, but also optimize procurement of pharmaceuticals. So getting a lot leaner in terms of how the healthcare industry works. But because we reward with like essentially a data asset, and one thing that's as important with our system is, it kind of touches on what you were saying in regards to AI as well, is that there is a need for some form of universal basic income. That's the way we see it. And we look at data as that universal basic income. So we've got a two token strategy, and that starts with a GDP linked reserve asset that's backed by the future of production, be it energy generation and compute. And we then have essentially this data asset, which has a dynamic relationship against the reserve. And that allows us to then reward users for specific data share to these intelligence platforms. And this is over both to the government, but also to private organizations through our data marketplace. So an organization looking for specific data can essentially filter through and receive a data packet and have a price. So it puts a lot more custody of your own personal data in your hands and turns it into a UBI. Essentially, the way we see things moving is that data is inevitable. We're always creating it, and we're only going to be creating more exponentially. And we create a system that essentially encourages more data to be created to refine a lot of these systems. In terms of your second question, I think I've got another business that I'm a shareholder of, and it's very much focused on agentic automation, and it works with Maya, and we're having a lot of discussions in regards to agentic automation of government. And we've worked with very large corporate clients in kind of executing on these workflows, save several $1 million for them. And we're seeing a lot of reception from like the UAE specifically in regards to implementing these autonomous workflows. And we kind of call it the invisible government, maximum governance. And I would say once you start to build out sort of the verifiability, I think there's one company we've been talking to, they actually kind of do the full audit, they provide verifiable agents, etc. There's a means to also ensuring it, and that's really the critical thing, is are you able to ensure these workflows and these agents that are executing it? And I believe Lloyd's TSB, large underwriter from the UK, has actually issued the first underwriting for AI. And that was against... I have to remember. Maybe I'll drop you a message later when I remember. But it's only going to get better, is what I would say. I don't necessarily trust it with my data.
Fair enough. Oh, speaking of internet systems,
Trying to protect my own infrastructure.
Yeah, 100%. Well, and so one of the things I think is interesting, just kind of rounding out the half hour here, is when we do bring like systems like Maya online and Althea online, and for those folks who are interested on Althea's progress, we have the L1 is launched, amazing group of validators and decentralized group of operators operate the chain. And then we built a machine-to-machine DAX, so something really bespoke and built, purpose-built for this utilities and infrastructure environment for swapping and liquidity. And that is on its last kind of stages. You can still get involved, kick the tires, be part of building that the right way. And then that's going to unlock here and, in very, very shortly. So get involved in our Discord if you're interested in that. But what's neat now about, Althea's blockchain coming live, that liquid infrastructure, of course, growing, and then now Maya launching, is these things can work together. And I'd love to hear if you have some thoughts about how Althea and Maya are synergistic or work together in those ways too, because I think there's a lot of intersection here that's exciting once things start to come on chain.
I think one of the things that really made us click was this idea of sort of bringing sovereignty, and that was a core focus of our discussion when we first met in Thailand. The way we see Maya, and look, we're protecting, obviously, data, we're making it security, we're empowering sovereignty, but it's very difficult to just take the app layer and do that. It needs to be sort of all the way down. And this is kind of our approach when working with these governments. And there's kind of okay, there's an education piece, there's obviously our solution, but there's a massive consulting element where, okay, we need to bring in everything from the hardware level, sort of layer zero, from data storage and localization of compute, and building up from there. And obviously, we're working on another project in a country in North Africa together, and which will be the first of its kind of private telco company. So I think we're just going to get quite big with that, how we sort of take that forward. Yeah, it's just about kind of the movement and how we can use what you fit within what we call our sovereign stack. And I'm actually publishing a paper probably in the next few days on what that sovereign stack looks like. So you might get a little plug there as well.
Oh, exciting. Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head. I just want to emphasize again, you see so many of these systems that come in, and maybe they're running on AWS, and those are big, it's a big thing with blockchain already. They're not running fully, hard infrastructure all the way down to that layer zero, and that creates vulnerabilities and systemic vulnerabilities and brittleness in the system. And I think it's one of those things that's easy to overlook, right? When you're interacting only at that app layer, you're really only seeing a superficial layer. And this is where we've had a lot of these things kind of break, right? So you're not really creating real sustainability and real change. And that's what I'm so excited about, what, Maya's perspective and yours perspective, Althea's of course as well too, is like it has to start from those solid foundations up. And then yeah, so super exciting stuff. How do people get involved in Maya? If you're interested in learning more, or maybe they have a protocol that they would like to interact with y'all, or
Yes, and we're on X. Obviously, I'm on X, Aaron Kez underscore, and then explore Maya underscore as well. I've got a Substack, which is governance.exe. So I'm publishing a lot more in regards to sort of building up the narrative in regards to what Maya is and what its unlocks are. And what I'm trying to do is actually bring a lot of relevance to real world topics. So as headlines are kind of coming out on around the world, sort of topical affairs, we're using Maya's solution to show how it would be solved, and to really sort of show that narrative, how we can actually tackle a lot of these challenges that are being faced just by having a system that brings everyone to the same level and turns governance into an ecosystem.
I appreciate that longer form content too. It does feel like we all have a bit of that, like, TikTok fatigue, right? Those really quick headlines and the AI and all of that fake stuff. It's really nice to digest something that really has some thoughtfulness and depth and content. And it's something we've been working on our side as well too, is to give folks some opportunity to really chew on that a bit, rather than
I
just
do
those.
enjoy it. I think if there's anything, it's kind of the idea of like fleshing ideas as well. You just once it's you sort of put pen to paper. Like my sort of creative process is to write it down on paper first before I move towards the keyboard. But it allows me to flesh out ideas, and I'm like more come to me. And it's the same when we were sort of going out. We built out a lot of our MVPs for our modules, and like I would open up Figma and do a lot of the designs myself to understand kind of the workflows. And just by going through that iterative process and really understanding how this could actually work and changes in the architecture, things that could be made better. So I would say it's necessary as part of being an entrepreneur and building out something like this, is to kind of take all of those intermediary steps and sort of fleshing out creativity in all different sort of mediums.
Yes, I have a stack of notebooks that I have accumulated, and the question is then what to do with all of the papers.
Deborah's memoir.
Very cool. Well, this is really exciting. It was great to chat with you today. Obviously, lots of exciting things happening on the Althea front and on the Maya front, and probably some things together happening that are exciting. So for folks that are listening, stay tuned. And we do these community calls every week with new and exciting folks. So you can also catch us on afterwards, or catch our calls on Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern. So thanks, Aaron. Any parting words as we wrap up the conversation?
No, thank you. Just follow. Just follow the guidance. Look. The mission's bold. Like what we're looking to accomplish is bold. It requires the power of the people. So anyone that wants to come support, wants to contribute, we're completely open. We just want to make this something that exists because we believe it should exist.
I love that. I mean, I think we've lost a little bit of our way in blockchain industry, but this is what I think a lot of us came together around the promise of what Bitcoin and blockchain could be, and that it could really create meaningful change that gave back agency, gave back choice and sovereignty to a diverse group of stakeholders. And I am here for that. And that's why I wake up and build every morning, and continue on and forward. So thank you so much for that message, and appreciate it. And looking forward to working together.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. All right. End stream.